o'clock. Happy Spring Forward Day. Said no one ever. A day so feared in the state of California, we put it on the ballot, for crying out loud. Oh man, I have put a little Red Bull in my coffee this morning. If you are just now getting here for the 11:30 service because you're early, we're glad you're here. Good to see you. We are coming to the end of our series, The Art of Living. We've been in this series for the last 8 weeks, and at the heart of this series, if you're just joining us, it's about wisdom. And it's Solomon, this guy who's written this, has given some very specific ways to be wise, to be a person who increases in our skill in the craft or in the art of living. And over and over again, Solomon just returns to some themes, and we've kind of hit the highlights throughout this series. We've left a lot on the table. We could do 48 weeks of this series. I mean, you could really just go on and on. But we've looked at friendship, that wise people are evaluating friendships, that wise people have discipline, that wise people set their alarm clocks and they get up for church on Spring Forward. That wise people, last week we looked at in terms of finances, that there's just certain patterns. And today we have saved the best for last. Last but not least, there's this theme again and again in the Proverbs of family relationships. Oftentimes what is the most powerful dynamic at play in our life, oftentimes what is the most painful dynamic at play in our life. Here's kind of Solomon's theme, that you cannot be a wise person and ignore family relationships, that you can't be wise and neglect the family relationships, the most powerful dynamics that are at play in our life. And so you see this in the Proverbs for him. We're going to look specifically at husbands, wives, some broad strokes, some sort of big themes, parents, kids, and adults, parents and adult kids relationships. I guess you would be an adult parent if you have adult kids. That dynamic as well in the Proverbs. And there's some rules that he gives us. Chances are pretty good you grew up in a house with some rules. Maybe they even hung they were on the refrigerator. Some rules that, kind of, sometimes these are kind of colloquialisms or statements that we have. Happy wife means, yeah, so cheesy. It's kind of a family rule. If mama ain't happy, that was only the moms. That was quite obvious. Some of you guys are like, oh, write that one down. I've never heard that. So there's never any for guys. Have you noticed that? There's no dad's the best unless he's stressed. It's always sort of these mom-centric rules. But here's why I say that, because whether they were spoken or unspoken, maybe you had an unspoken rule that if it's awkward, we sweep it under the rug, sort of that. Some of us grew up in families like that. Nobody put it on the refrigerator, but it was a rule. The reason why this is important is because Solomon, in 3 specific family dynamics, is going to give us some rules, some things to hang on the refrigerator. If you have a Bible, you can open it with me to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis sets some context for the Proverbs, because what Solomon is doing again and again is he's returning us to the order of things. The established order that God has in the very beginning of how the world is supposed to work. What you see in the beginning is God has created the sun, he's created energy, he's created the world. He's separated day from night. He's separated earth from sea. He's done some separation. But what he's brought together is the husband and wife. It's his first act in terms of people. There is a marriage ceremony that sets the context for some things that Solomon is trying to return us to. So if you have a Bible, Genesis chapter 2. If you don't, you can follow along on the screens. That's okay too, or download the CRB app. Genesis chapter 20, or Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 20 together. It says this: but for Adam, the first man, and literally, if you remember the story, God forms Adam from the dirt. In fact, the name Adam means from the dirt. Adama is where it comes from the dirt, the first man from the dirt, which means, ladies, if you've ever talked about a guy in such a way, he's such a dirtball. Pretty theological statement there. Don't applaud at that. Do not feed the animals at the zoo. It only encourages them if you laugh at these terrible jokes. Okay. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. We'll come back to that word. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib that he had taken out of the man. He brought her to the man. Now, this is a marriage ceremony, a marriage proposal, kind of awkward, but it's essentially, this is what Adam says to the first woman, his first words. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of the man. So they get married. This is the marriage proposal, and God brings Adam, Eve, the first man and woman together. Now it says that for Adam, no suitable helper, that for this dirtball, no suitable helper was found. And the word helper there, it's kind of a poor translation of the actual word. The word that's used in Hebrew is this word azer, the word helper, it's this word azer. Azer, we'll try that. Let's try it on the count of three. Azer, 1, 2, 3. Azer, well done. And a better translation of the word, you see this translated several times in the scriptures. Azer is the word rescuer. Think about it. It's the same word that David uses when he's on the run from Saul and he's crying out to God, God, would you be my Azer? Would you be my rescuer? So we often read it like Eve comes along just to run some errands for Adam. She's just kind of this helper, just fetching Adam things left and right. But it's deeper than that. There's a kind of connection that it's not good for man to be alone. That he needs something more. So a rescuer. Eve is going to enter into the picture. Now he says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. In Hebrew, bone is a symbol of strength. Flesh is a symbol of weakness. What he's essentially declaring is where I'm weak, you're strong. Where I'm strong, you're weak. It's as if we just fit perfectly together. God has made us for one another. And he's essentially declaring there's harmony between the two of them. There's no power struggle. There's no argument. There's no, sense of hostility against the other. There's this deep understanding where I'm weak, you're strong. Where I'm strong, you're weak. We profoundly need each other. This is what the marriage dynamic. It's a friendship between the two. There's harmony between the first man, the first woman at the first marriage. Now, if you've been hanging around church for a while, you know everything falls apart. Sin enters into the picture. The capacity to break things enters into the picture. Adam and Eve eat from the tree that God said, do not eat from, and the world essentially unravels. And all of a sudden, what you see immediately is this thing, where I'm weak, she's strong, where I'm strong, she's weak. Immediately, the first thing that happens is an argument breaks out. There's a bit of God says what's going on. He did it, she did it. Nobody had to teach them how to do this, by the way. They instinctively had a problem from the very beginning. Now, God is going to put a curse on humanity. Genesis 3, verse 16. We'll read this in just a moment. It's in a way, it's a blessing, because now the world is a dangerous place. And God is going to put this curse that's going to create this sense of need for God onto the man, onto the woman. And this is what the curse declares. Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. John 3:16 is to heal this, but this is Genesis 3:16. This is the curse. To the woman, he said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. And the Hebrew word for severe is epidural. This is so terrible. This is so terrible jokes. Thank you for laughing. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, the word desire here, it's not in a sexual sense. It's not you will desire, you will long for your husband. The word is to desire your husband. It's essentially you will try to fix the man. I'll choose my words very carefully today. You will try to fix the man, and in turn, he will try to rule over you. This is in the same way that a king would try to rule over his subjects. That essentially, here's the point. There's now going to be this power struggle. What was easy and just flowed, where I'm weak, she's strong, where I'm strong, she's weak. Now there is a break. There's going to be a power struggle. I would argue this curse is in motion in 21st century America, wouldn't you agree? In coffee shops, in divorce courtrooms, on the way to church perhaps, this power struggle. I don't like the way you drive. I don't like the way you park. I don't like you. Just over and over again. The way this plays itself out in Rosanna and I's marriage, I'm the spender, she's the saver. So there's this constant, if we go to a restaurant and someone tries to upcharge me on something, the answer is always yes. Would you like avocado? Of course. Bacon? Yes. Would you like egg? Yes. Sun-dried tomato? Yeah. Your burger will be $42 today, Mr. And Rosanna's going, wait, you paid $3 for the avocado. Are you kidding me? Our neighbor has an avocado tree, for crying out loud. Why? Or a couple weeks ago, I was watching the Consumer Electronics Show, and I don't know if any of you saw this. There was this, they debuted this new technology that they said is going to be in cell phones soon, that you'll be able to bend and fold your iPhone. And I was floored at this technological revelation. And so I told Rosanna at dinner, I said, did you see this? These new phones will come out eventually, and we will be able to fold our iPhone. Isn't that incredible? And she asked the obvious question, what's wrong with the iPhone that you have? And I gave the obvious answer, it does not fold. Duh. Anyways, this has turned into a bit of a marital therapy session. Rosanna, would you like to come up and defend yourself? Anyway, moving along. Now, this curse goes in full swing, and by the time Solomon is going to pick up his pen, by the way, essentially what has happened, God's first act is to create the family, the husband, the wife. And the enemy's first act of war is going to be destroying this family. If you can tear this apart, well, you can make the world unravel. If you can tear this apart, husband, wife, then everything else will begin to fall apart. By 3 pages later, one of their kids kills the other kid. Everything begins to go wrong. So by the time Solomon picks up his pen, marriage in the world of Solomon, and I would argue this is even true to a certain extent in our world, certainly in various places of the world, marriage is not for love. Marriage in the world of Solomon is a social contract. It's something that you enter into to gain social status. In a world of caste systems, if I marry you, it gives me a leg up. If you marry me, it gives your family a leg up. That was the purpose of marriage. And so Solomon, he has some assumptions in his teaching or in his Proverbs about this husband-wife dynamic. And these are all throughout the Proverbs, but I want to look at one specifically, Proverbs chapter 2, verse 17. In a world of social contracts for marriage, where love is not a factor, you get married for procreation and to gain social status and acceptance. That's why you get married. Solomon is going to offer some very radical words on what marriage is supposed to be. And there's a rule here that I think we can get from this. Proverbs chapter 2, verse 17. This is what Solomon says. He's talking about a wife, but the same would apply to a man. She has left the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. There's 2 words here that are central, companion, covenant. She's left the companion of her youth. So this husband-wife got married at a young age, and she leaves the companionship of her youth and has forgotten the covenant of her God. So his assumption here of what marriage is, and this was radical in his world, and I would say it's radical in our world, is that marriage is companionship. It's for the purpose not of social contract, not for the purpose of, well, you have the role you play, I have the role that we play. You don't get married because, well, we were 30 and it was just time. You get married for this idea of companionship. It's friendship. He's returning us to Genesis 2. That you would have this understanding. We need each other. Where I'm strong, she's weak. Where I'm weak, she's strong. We need each other. That it would be a friendship. His question essentially is your spouse your best friend? Or is it just she has her role, I have my role? We share a house, and we share some legal documents that kind of bind us together, but that's it. As Mike Foster says, I love this, work on your togetherness, work on your friendship. That's his question, that you would be best friends. He's returning us to Genesis 2. Now, there's this other word that he uses, and it's the word covenant. Covenants don't make a lot of sense in our world, but they are all throughout the Bible. And a covenant relationship, that's essentially what God has with you, what God has with me. When you stepped into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, you entered into a covenant relationship with God. That essentially means this: regardless of what you have done, regardless of what you are doing or will ever do, God will not turn his back on you. Regardless of bad behavior, God will not turn his back on you because he has established a covenant with you. Covenants don't make a lot of sense in our world. There's not a lot of covenant relationships left. A covenant relationship that the only one that really is left in terms of family relationships in our culture is a parent's relationship to a child. That's the only one that if mom or dad turns their back, there's any sort of a negative social stigma that's attached. In our culture, marriage is not a covenant relationship. We think of it as a consumer relationship. That in the same way you buy a car, or in the same way you would try to purchase a house, the questions you would ask, you evaluate the purchase. Do I like it? Does it fit my needs? If it ceases to do that, well, then I can just trade it in and get a different model. That's the attitude and the cultural assumption. Marriage in our culture has gone from a covenant bond to a consumer relationship. We live in the world of the no-fault divorce. California kicked this off in 1970. We were the first state. We're number one to go after this idea that you don't need to get a lawyer, a judge involved for $140 or whatever it is. You can undo in 30 minutes what's taken 30 years to build. By 2010, New York, the last state, every state, all 50 states have this idea of a no-fault divorce, changing, sort of accepting this idea of marriage as a consumer relationship. I would say this has predominantly led to two myths in our culture about love, about marriage. The first, and you hear this a lot, is that marriage is just a sheet of paper. You hear this, people that are dating, people that are single. Why would I get married? After all that marriage is just a sheet of paper. You see this in couples that are dating. One spouse kind of pushing for this idea of marriage. The other in the relationship, the dating relationship, I know we've been together 12 years, but why would we get married? Marriage is just a sheet of paper is the assumption. You see this with married couples after years and years together, hits the rough spot. After all, what's really binding us together, it's just a sheet of paper. In the Bible, it's not a piece of paper. It's a covenant. This is the reason why marriage is still, the day of marriage is still what it is in our culture. When you got married, you bought the most expensive dress that you own, now sitting in the garage, perhaps. You wore an outfit you haven't worn since. You invited all your friends, all your family. You paid a lot of money. You stood before a pastor, a judge, and you said vows to a pastor, but really through a pastor to God, that you were making this covenant. It's often a hollow ceremony in our culture. In our world, marriage is often a declaration of present love or past love. This is what consumer relationships turn it into. We've been together for a couple years, seems to be working out. We're here today. In the Bible, marriage is not a declaration of present love, it's a declaration of future love. Till death do us part, in sickness and in health. We are here. We're not going anywhere. We are bound together. There's another myth in our culture, and it's this idea that love is just a feeling. You hear this a lot. It's a deep cultural assumption. Covenants push back against this. You hear people talk about love in such a way, Cupid did it, we can't explain it, the forces of nature kind of drew us together. Who are we to turn our back on the forces of nature? If that's true, that love is just a feeling, then no marriage in this room is safe. You are one plane ride away from falling or having feelings for your seatmate. You are one argument away with your spouse from no longer having feelings with him or her. In the scriptures, love is never described as a feeling. It's described as an action, something that you do for the benefit of someone else. Yes, there is emotion attached to it, but it's something that you do. It's not just something that you feel. It's deeper than that. It's a covenant bond, more than just an emotional whim in the moment. It's a declaration of future love, not just present or past. I would say there's a rule here that you could extrapolate from what Solomon believes about marriage. You could say it this way, that marriage needs a covenant for safety. That in the arguments, in the conflict, that the divorce card would come off the table. It wouldn't be something you'd flash when you're angry. It needs a covenant for safety. We're here. And it also needs a friendship to flourish. It needs this bond. When do you work on your friendship as a married couple? When do you have moments of where I'm weak, she's strong, where I'm strong, she's weak? We need each other. It needs a friendship to flourish. Now, chances are 100% that somewhere along the way, your parents decided to have kids. And this is another extension of the family. And Solomon, he returns to this parent-child dynamic again and again. He has lots of proverbs on parenting. And as we talk through these, listen, you can do everything right as a parent. You can follow Solomon's words, and everything can still go wrong in the life of your son or daughter. Listen, Adam and Eve had a great dad, and they still got really messed up, didn't they? And this is true through all the things that we're talking about. As we talk through what I was saying a few moments ago about marriage, you can do everything right, and everything can fall apart in your marriage. If you're here and you're divorced, and as we talk through that, you go, well, that just makes me feel guilty. The only sins that matter in the New Testament are the ones that Jesus paid for. And it's about your future relationships. It's about your present reality. It's not about your past. The New Testament turns the page and invites us to do the same. But in terms of moms and dads towards children, Solomon has some very specific rules about how we should parent. And we could talk all day. Well, what's the goal of being a parent? Is it to get them to high school? Is it to make sure they live to 20? What's sort of the goal? For Solomon, his goal for us as parents is that you would want to make your children wise. That's the goal. That what you would do is that you would begin to make your son or daughter wise. Some of us hear that and you go, I'm doing a terrible job as a parent. But that's his goal, that you would begin to raise up sons and daughters that would be wise. This is what he says, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 11. He gives this very sort of practical teaching on who God is, but also what a parent is like. He says this, verse 11 and 12, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those that he loves, as a father the son he delights in. There's these words here, discipline and delight, discipline and delight. Now, all throughout the scriptures, God is described as a father. That metaphor, that picture is used again and again. In Proverbs 3:11, this is the only place you see God described as a father. And he's the kind of father who delights in you. This is what DJ was talking about earlier, that God delights in you today, not because of what you do, but because of your existence as a human being. God delights in you. You're made in the image of God. God takes great pleasure in the fact that you're breathing today and that you're here. He delights in you as a father does. And at the same time, God disciplines those that he loves. And these are not mutually exclusive. God does not discipline you in spite of the fact that he delights in you. He disciplines you because he delights in you. And his goal is to make you wise. And Solomon is saying the same thing is true as a parent. That God's given us this model of discipline and delight. As a parent, if your kids are under your control, under your care in your house, you walk this fine line between discipline and delight. It's a checklist. It's a mental checklist as you're raising kids. Are we disciplining them and are we delighting in them? Solomon says many times throughout the Proverbs that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. You probably did not need a verse to tell you that. And because of that, they need you, they need mom, they need dad to give discipline. At the same time, the heart of a child, they're wrestling with questions of identity. Who am I? Where do I belong? Why do I matter? They need delight. They need to know their existence matters, regardless of bad behavior, regardless of what they do. You see these two models of discipline and delight. They're everywhere in our culture. Chances are pretty good if we went to coffee and you were to tell me about your parents, you might talk about your parents. Well, I grew up in a house, it was authoritarian. My dad was, maybe mom, dad, it was a conservative, traditional household. I don't mean that in a political sense, but it was sort of that, maybe for religious reasons or military reasons. It was rigid. You knew what time you needed to be in bed. You knew what time you needed to wake up. You knew you had to have a summer job. There was sort of this culture in your house of discipline and control. Discipline and control. On the other side of the coin, especially if you grew up in more modern society with modern thinking parents, oftentimes the way in which you see this oftentimes in terms of age breakdown, boomers, millennials, the thinking is to delight in your kids, that the goal of parenting, it's not discipline and control, but you might describe your parents or you might describe your parenting technique as building self-esteem. That's often the project of modern parenting books. Build self-esteem, that's the goal. The Hebrew word here is participation trophy. Such a bad joke. But that becomes the thinking, that we're here to build self-esteem in our kids. Both of those, Solomon says, are fine. Both of those are good, but it's not one or the other. It's both. You need discipline and control. If either one is neglected, or you need discipline and delight. If either one is neglected, you will derail the project of making your kids wise. If you grew up in a home, and we'll all have a tendency to want to veer towards one or the other, but if you grew up in a home that was just about discipline and control, what happened when you graduated high school? You could not wait. You were like a pit bull running out of a cage in that moment. And it derailed, didn't it? It backfired. It derailed the project of making you wise. If you grew up in a home where all your parents did was tell you that you were great and they just delighted in you, and they never gave you any rules, any structure, listen, you know this is true. Your kids do not need a tall friend. They need you, mom, dad, to bring discipline in their life, to establish structure, so that their entire life, they wouldn't just hear your voice of what to do and what not to do. They would begin to develop their own. And so Solomon has given this rule. It's a broad strokes rule, but we will, something you hang on the refrigerator, discipline your kids, delight in your kids, but not at the expense of discipline. Discipline your kids, but not at the expense of delight. You find different ways. Discipline's a broad word. That's the point. One of my kids, Hayden, I look at him the wrong way, he melts into a puddle. One of my kids, Dane, I look at him the wrong way, he sees it as a challenge. You find a way, it's specific. You know this is true. With every child, it's unique how you do this. That's the wisdom of the scriptures. Discipline, delight, these are broad words. Friendship, these are broad words. How you work on the friendship of your marriage. The covenant, these are sort of broad concepts. And that's the wisdom of the scriptures and why this endures for 2,700 years. You turn the page if you, as you grow up, as your parents grow up, if you are an adult with parents that are still in the world, Solomon has given some rules, whether you're 15 or 50, for how we should treat our moms and our dads. This is the wisdom of the scriptures. Here's sort of a third rule that we'll arrive at in terms of family dynamics and family relationships. He says this, Proverbs 23, verse 22. Listen to your father who gave you life. I love that verse. I quote that daily to my boys. Listen to your father who gave you life. And do not despise your mother when she is old. Oh, my car's getting egged in the parking lot just reading this verse. If she is, don't mention it. There's this idea. Some of us, you grew up in a house where your mom or dad hung verses on the wall. This was probably not one of them. But what's his point? Do not despise your mother when she is old. If your mom is old, what does that mean about you? Yeah, you're old too. You have grown up. You have left the house. And it's written here in the negative, do not despise your mother. But written in the positive, and this is a sweeping theme throughout the scriptures. You see it in Ephesians, you see it in Exodus, you see it here in Proverbs. You honor your father and mother. Whether you are 15 or whether you're 50, you honor them. And honor is a broad word, isn't it? The scriptures don't even say you have to like your mom and dad, but they do say you have to find a way to honor them. That wise people begin to find ways to honor their parents, no matter what age you are or what age they are. If they are breathing, find a way to honor them. Even if they're deceased, you honor them in your speech and how you talk. You find a way to honor them. The scriptures, and this is the wisdom of the Bible, it doesn't say obey your mom and dad. At certain ages and stages of life, that's exactly what you should do. If you're 15, you should obey your mom and dad. At certain ages and stages of life, if you don't obey your mom and dad, if you're 5 and you don't obey your mom and dad, the results will be catastrophic. You will not make it to 6. But if you're 50 and you're still obeying your mom and dad, the results are equally catastrophic in your life. That the word is honor, and there's a wisdom to that. You find a way to honor your mom and dad. Wise people, they don't just, I'm finally out of here, I'm neglecting this relationship. They find a way to bring honor into their house. It's a broad word, that's the point. Notice this next part. He says this, Proverbs chapter 20, verse 20. You back up 3 chapters. He says, if someone curses their father or mother, this is true for if you're out of the house, in the house, if someone curses their father and mother, their lamp will be snuffed out in pitch darkness. If you curse your mom and dad, if you are bitter, you hold on to rage, resentment, anger, it dims the light. It doesn't allow you to bring light into the world and be the person that God's called you to be. If you hold on, if you're cursing your mom and dad, if you're still bitter and still angry. All of us in this room, you know people who have grown up, left the house, and life has not turned out the way they thought it was supposed to turn out. If you think real hard, you could probably think of somebody, whether vocationally, financially, relationally, life took some wrong directions, some wrong turns. And you know people that their response to that is, I own this, we're going to get through it, I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps, I'm going to turn to my faith, but it's my dilemma, it's my crisis to deal with. At the same time, I imagine you know people that are in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, and when life unravels, they look back and they still blame mom and dad for the way they were raised. And Solomon's point is, if you've never let go of that, it will dim your light in your life. His point is essentially this. You were not raised by the gods. You were raised by broken people. That's God's project and his plan for raising up healthy adults, broken people. And as you begin to realize that and you start to see life unravel or you see things don't go your way, there might be that tendency to look back. If my mom would have done this, if only my dad would have done this. The reason I treated my husband that way is because, my mom and dad, this was their dynamic. Solomon's point is, look, eventually you're just 40. Eventually it's your mess. And if you're still looking back and you're still bitter, you're still cursing them, you have not left their house. They still control you and they still own you. You have not grown up. You see this in certain conversations with friends, with family. Somebody might say, well, I don't budget. I don't want to do that because I grew up in a house where my family was so strict with money and I hated it. My mom and dad were so frugal. We couldn't even buy an avocado. There was this. It was strict. You just got tired of it. Everything was so, penny pinching and frugal. And so they grow up and they reject the wisdom of being a person who budgets. You are still under your mom and dad's roof, Solomon said. Your cursing of them, you're being angry at them, has dimmed your light in the world. Or people, I'll never go to church. I'm not a Christian. Why? Because I grew up in church and every single week we had to go. Dad forced us to go Wednesday nights, Sunday mornings. We were there and we hated it. And I told myself when I was 18, I will never go back to church. If that's the reason you don't go to church, your mom and dad still own you. You have not left their house. You are still making decisions because you're still making decisions formed by them. Your light has been dimmed, is Solomon's point. Eventually, you're just 40. Eventually, you're just 50. You have to make, it's your life. You have to begin to let go of the hurts and the scars that are there from childhood. So there's a family rule here. As you age, as your parents age, there's a wisdom. Honor your father and mother, no matter what age they are, no matter what age you are, and also be a person who forgives no matter what behavior they've done. Forgive, let go, because if you don't, you are still owned by them, no matter if you're 50 or 60 years old. You're still under their control. Your light will be dimmed. Forgive, be a person who practices the art of forgiveness. The first place that gets hit in the scriptures is the family. And for wise people, the first place they begin to return to is the family, of beginning to ask questions of healing and asking questions of wisdom. There's some rules that Solomon gives for what wise people do. And that is the Proverbs. End scene on our series. As we were thinking this week as a creative team, as DJ and I were meeting about how to wrap this series up, there's a proverb that we could have done 40 weeks on this series, but there's a proverb that is sort of foundational, but we never read it. And some of us, this is the most famous proverb to you. It's a proverb that you see written places. It's a proverb that people get tattooed on them. And I just want to read this because I think it's the best place for us to land this series. And all the things that we've talked about, whether it's been money or whether it's friendship or whether it's self-discipline or whether it's moms, dads, whatever the tripwire is for you, being a wise person. This is Solomon's wish for us, and it's my wish for you. It's my wish for our church. He says, trust in the Lord, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord. In fact, can we just read this together? On the count of 3, let's read this verse together. 1, 2, 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Lean not on your own understanding. My prayer for you, my prayer for our church, is that you would have the wisdom to know what's right, and you would have the courage to do what's right, regardless of the cost. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for these words. We thank you that you want more for us than we often want for ourselves. And I pray we didn't just take this as principles. We didn't just take this as rules. We would take it as a leading in the direction of a loving Father who disciplines and delights. Would you give us the eyes to see what's wise, the mind to know what's wise, and give us the courage to do something about it. It's in Jesus' name that we pray.